Thank you very much. This is an incredible honor to be invited to give this lecture in honor of Rachel Carson and all the many environmental scholars around the world that have contributed so much to our knowledge base. Today, I'm going to talk about a body of work that has almost culminated in a paper that a group of us have been working on for a long time. The paper that is not quite in draft form, but I hope will be very soon, is titled Gross External Damages of Nutrient Water Pollution. The group of colleagues who are working on this are listed here below my name. Dave Kaiser, Tina Andarj, Jeff Arnold, Katrin Bieger, Manuel Hoke, Youngji Ji, myself, Dan Fineff, Nilesh Shinde, Jimmy Scher, and Mike White. It's important to me and to our team that everybody understand this is a very large group project, and every single person on that list has contributed a lot. Very multidisciplinary and a terrific group of people to work with. All right, let me jump right into my talk. I've got a few pictures on here to sort of warm you up to the area that I will be talking about, which is nutrient pollution. I'm going to use through this lecture the term nutrient pollution somewhat interchangeably with nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. These are natural nutrients that occur naturally. They're in fact essential for life in aquatic ecosystems, plants, food webs, etc. The issue, however, has come from human use of fertilizers. We're incredibly innovative animals, and we have created a very impressive, robust production agriculture system using fertilizer as critical inputs. While this has produced a lot of wonderful good things for humanity, it has also become a source of a major externality. The picture you see is probably something many of you in the Michigan State area have seen, and that is a farm field being fertilized with liquid fertilizer. So there are many issues associated with excess nutrients. One of the ones that we are hearing a lot more about these days, and I know Michigan has its share of, are harmful algal blooms, also known as HABs. These can contain poison. There are a variety of different type of harmful algal blooms. CDC puts out um, uh, explanation of the sorts of things that these can do to people. In the highest concentrations, they can kill animals, potentially humans, but marine mammals, pets, livestock, and so on. This type of excess algae now occurs very broadly around the country. So every time I talk about this stuff, I always like to find a few local pictures for people. And so it isn't hard to do, especially in Michigan. These are all from the Michigan Sea Grant website, and multiple pictures of harmful algal blooms, including drinking water, as you see on the top right, and icky green stuff with the fish kill there on the left, and broad algal blooms on the bottom right. They do occur now in all states. There are a variety of different types of blooms, as I mentioned earlier. The ones that are mostly problematic in freshwater, like Michigan, are the cyano harmful algal blooms, the HABs. And that's probably what I kind of want you to think about as I'm talking about water pollution. Another, I kind of think of it as a poster child of the issue of over nutrient use in the environment, is a dead zone, a particular one in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a very large, annually recurring dead zone. You're looking at a map of Louisiana and Texas, and the measured size of the hypoxic zone in, I think, yeah, I put up 2019 as the example year I used. What happens is when all of that kind of algae and phytoplankton comes down the Mississippi River or any other river into ocean, it carries with it all those nutrients, and those nutrients grow the algae, just as I described. When the algae dies, it falls through the water column and uses up the oxygen so that you get areas where there is literally no or such a small amount of oxygen that nothing can live. On this particular picture, all of the red area is hypoxic at levels that cannot sustain life. And so the animals that do live there either die or they swim to the edges. The uh, Hypoxia Task Force, which has been around for about 30 years, has a 40 years now, I guess, gosh, has a goal that the annual size of that zone should be no bigger than about 1,900 kilometers square. You can see that level at the bottom of the screen. Um, and you can also see that the 5-year running average has never been even close to that goal. The point here is simply that this is another very visible manifestation of the problem of nutrient pollution, and we're really making no meaningful progress in moving forward. Okay, so where is all this pollution coming from? This is a map indicating the upper Mississippi River Basin, the entire basin. The amount of nutrients that are delivered into the Gulf of Mexico come entirely from the water in this basin. Um, the majority of the water in the basin, the majority of the nutrients come from agriculture. 60% is direct from farm fields. About 26% comes from atmospheric deposition, but some of that is also agriculture because, as again, folks who live in and around an agricultural area probably have noticed, when the wind blows, a lot of particulate matter from ag fields gets up into the air, and that some of that then falls into fresh waters. Those who know again about agriculture would not be surprised at the role of agriculture in contributing to nutrient pollution. This is a map of the agricultural footprint across the United States, the continental US. 44% of the land area in the United States is used by agriculture. It's farmland. The map you're seeing shows you the density of that farmland across the country, and those deep green areas are areas that are almost entirely used by agriculture. The only colored areas that have no agriculture are the blue ones, those are major waters, and the gray blobs. Everything else has at least some, but those lighter areas have a less amount of density. So in many ways, it's not at all surprising that agricultural is the main source. It's further not surprising because the vast majority of that agricultural land is not subject to any regulation related to nutrient pollution. The NPDES permits that are issued to control and limit water pollution from industry and point sources do not apply to that area. And so, over the last 50 years, there's really been no serious attempt to control the nutrient pollution coming off those fields. Not terribly surprising that the externality has not been controlled. Okay, let me jump to the role of our work. That was all just background to kind of provide, hopefully, a strong motivation for what this work is all about. I've got an economics kind of slide here, but it's not supply and demand. So it's a different kind of economics. Um, and it's something that you've all heard of all the time. It's a commonly used measure of economic well-being, gross domestic product or gross national product. This is a measure of economic activity that countries produce. We usually do them quarterly. You've all heard about when we're in a recession or we're leaving a recession. All of that kind of information is based on this type of measure. All it is a measure of the total quantity of stuff produced, all the shoes and all the hats, all the Velveeta cheese, everything that is produced in a given period in the United States, multiplied by its price. Is price times quantity in economic terms. And this is used and has been used for over 100 years to provide an indicator of the health of economic well-being. It is a very useful measure. We use it for lots of stuff. I've put on my slide, is GDP a good measure of all of the goods and services that we have? The answer to that is no. This is well known amongst economists. You will see it in principles textbooks if you've taken a macroeconomics class. It is well known that it misses some very potentially important components of goods and services. It misses the fact that when we build wooden furniture, we cut down trees. And so we are depleting our resource base unless those trees are replanted. It misses damages done from pollution, water pollution, air pollution, climate change, by the production of our goods and services. Those things are not measured in GDP, and it misses ecosystem services. Again, this is a known problem. It is a problem that is increasingly receiving attention. Our work is meant to move us towards being able to put a number that is comparable to GDP on water pollution. We will be referring to this, I'll be referring to this as estimating gross external damages, GED. This is a really simple notion. It's weird words for non-economists, I realize, but the idea is really very simple. Let's measure the pollution that it comes from all of our sources of, in this case, it'll be agricultural, primarily water pollution. And let's figure out the economic damages associated with that pollution. We don't buy and sell water pollution in a market like we buy and sell Velveeta cheese or socks. But that does not mean that the water pollution or ecosystem services don't have value. They have a great deal of value. Water pollution generally has negative value. It reduces our enjoyment of water, but it has a damage associated with it. And from an economic perspective, that is conceptually the same as a price. There isn't a market price. And so what we do is take our set of economic tools and estimate the market, a price, of value just at the margin of one more unit of water pollution. So this whole body of work is an example of an integrated assessment model. Economists have been working with a variety of environmental scientists to develop integrated assessment models. There is one that has been used and produced very effectively for air pollution. It's called APEEP, and I've got some citations listed there. The most famous and talked about integrated assessment models are in climate. So if you have heard of the social cost of carbon or the social cost of greenhouse gases, those are coming from integrated assessment models for climate change, something like the model that we're building here for water pollution. Let me give you conceptually what this is about. I've got this sort of cartoon version. While I talk through this, I want you to think about the United States. And I'll show you a map of the United States shortly. But in order to build this model, think about that map of the United States. The first thing we need is to place on that map nutrient loads, the nitrogen and phosphorus that is being emitted primarily from agriculture, but not entirely, on the landscape. So that top right picture you see is meant to depict the source of nutrient pollution. Once we know where all this loading is coming from across the landscape, where there's more, where there's less, then we need to recognize that water moves, and with it moves pollutants, all pollutants. Nitrogen and phosphorus, again, are the ones that we'll be focused on here. So we need a model that we can overlay on that landscape that moves the water and with it the pollution from where it is loaded onto the landscape downstream to where it ultimately impacts water quality concentrations and translates into a change in ecosystem services. Value generating services is just another term that you can use to think about that. In this work, I will be showing you estimates of changes in those ecosystem services. I'll be looking at recreation. I'll be looking at drinking water costs. I will be looking at amenity values, and by that, I'm going to mean sort of the visibility and beauty or lack thereof of water quality near where people live. And then I'm going to be talking about some climate costs as well. Things I put things like health on here because those should conceptually be part of this, and we're working to implement those, but we don't yet have components of health implications of, for example, if people get rashes associated with swimming near a harmful algal bloom. Finally, in our integrated assessment model, we will then be using economic models to place marginal damages, that value, that price, onto these changes in ecosystem services. As I've already mentioned a couple times, we're not quite done. It's close. The hydrology component is not finished, which means it's not fully calibrated. I'll talk briefly about that component. And we don't have all of the links yet to do all of the downstream connections, what I'll be referring to as fate and transport. But we have a big chunk of it done, and I'll show you those results as well. Okay, I tried to sort of lay out the 4 steps. What I'm going to do now is give you a tiny bit more detail on those 4 steps, and then I'm just going to jump into the results. So, as I said, the first thing we need to build this model are the nutrient loads. We need to know where are nitrogen and phosphorus pollution being loaded onto the landscape. This the base information that we're using is coming from my colleagues, our colleagues that are work with the soil and water assessment tool, so-called SWOT model. Jeff Arnold, Katrin Biggin, and Mike White, who were co-authors, are all key developers and users, implementers of the SWOT model. Our basic water pollution and hydrology, fate, and transport work comes completely from them. So this is a depiction of the loading, where it is that nitrogen and phosphorus are most loaded into surface waters. Based on that picture of agriculture I shared with you, and probably some of you, based on your own knowledge, will not be surprised to see that the very dark areas where the highest nutrient loading is occurring is across the Corn Belt and other agricultural regions. There are still some municipal sources, so that it is not entirely ag, but agriculture is by far the dominant source. And you can see that quite near where you folks mostly are in East Lansing, there's quite a bit of loading, and again, that's agriculture. Second, we needed a fate and transport hydrology model. What I have on here for you is a map of the watersheds across the United States that are termed the size of a Huck 8. They're called Huck 8s because USGS gives them each a number, which has 8 digits. This is a very useful map for me to show you because it also shows you the basic unit of analysis of our model. We will be developing these marginal damage and emission estimates for each of the Huck 8s. They'll each differ from one another potentially. There'll be 2,000, around 2,200 of these Huck 8s. For those of you who aren't real familiar with this kind of unit, it's sort of the size of a county because there's around 2,000 counties in the US. It's just to give you a sense of kind of the scale at which we're working. All of these watersheds are digitized based on the National Hydrology data set. They have very carefully identified all the river networks and flow directions. So we have this nutrient fate and transport models that I'm not even going to try to talk about this. This is mostly to flip by and ask you to pretty much trust the economist, or don't trust the economist, trust the hydrologists on our team to have done a good job with this. This is the model base on which the hydrology, land use, and water quality is based in our work. And as you can see, it's very spatially refined. It is based on these hydrologic units. There's a citation to this model. You're more than welcome, of course, to read it. And if you want even more detailed stuff about the National Agroecosystems Model, there's another slide you can take a look at. Again, I'm not going to try to provide you with the detail. There's just a huge shout out to my colleagues who have developed this incredible body of work, and which then allows us to work with them to develop this integrated assessment model. So now I'm going to jump right into the stuff I know more about, and that is step 3 in our chain, which is to now start to think about how to measure and monetize the impacts from nutrient pollution once it makes its way downstream and affects the concentrations of nutrients in waterways. As I said, there'll be 4 kinds of damages I'm going to show you estimates of. First, um, I'll be talking about drinking water. Nitrates in particular, we have nitrogens, we have standards of 10 parts per million for drinking water. And if our drinking water gets close to violating that standard, then our community water systems undertake expensive, some costly, you can decide whether you think they're very expensive or not, treatment. So that is a cost that is borne by society and ratepayers in particular in order to meet health standards. A second component is recreation. There's a huge body of literature, some great work from folks at Michigan State that have documented the changes in recreational use and enjoyment associated with water pollution, and indeed have done a lot of important work to monetize that, the loss in that recreation opportunities. A third area is what economists use the term hedonics, but skip that. What that really means is that people like to live near clean water. And they like to live near clean water to such a degree that they will pay sometimes substantially more for a house near a water body that does not have harmful algal blooms or does not have other contaminants compared to a similar house or a nearly identical house somewhere else. That gives us a very clear measure of the economic value people place on water quality. Finally, there's some new work that's new to me that relates nutrients that enter freshwater lakes, ponds, um, that makes those lakes and ponds eutrophied, gunky, full of the kinds of weeds and whatnot that those earlier pictures depicted. That has an effect of changing those ponds and lakes from a sink for greenhouse gases to a source. And in particular, it turns them into methane sources. Methane emissions. So we're going to be using a simple estimate of the methane emissions associated with nutrients with eutrophication to estimate damages from greenhouse gases. I am going to go super fast through the details. There's the slides will be provided. You can get more information. Eventually, there'll be a paper that will have all of this detail in appendices and so on. But I want to give you a very quick idea of how we're constructing our damage estimates. And then I'm going to jump right into showing you our current set of estimates. So, social cost, the first one is drinking water. How do we do this? There is some work that has been done by economists to estimate how much it costs if the source water from a drinking water facility has more nitrogen in it. So they know, they have an estimate of how much it costs to clean up that nitrogen in our drinking water treatment plants. We take that cost number and we match it with all of the drinking water treatment facilities around the country. We know where they are located, not exact Latin long, but by city and county. We know the size of the population of people they serve, and we know the nutrient concentrations from the raw water quality. We then match that with census data, and that gives us an estimate of the cost associated with removing 1 more kilogram of nitrogen from surface waters. Here, just to give you a notion of the extent, is a map of where the roughly 50,000 community water systems are located. About 80%, 85% of Americans get their water from community water systems. And here's the first number I'm going to give you. Following the process of constructing these cost estimates, attributing them to the population of census from census block groups, our model estimates that there is a gross external damage, the cost times the total amount of emissions coming from nitrates, of about $629 million per year. That is big or small, depending on what you're comparing it to. So keep that number in mind, and I'll come back to it. But first, I'm going to go through the other three components of damages. We'll be comparing them relative to each other as we go through. And then I'm going to put it all together and give you a sense of comparison to other things that I think will hopefully help you understand the magnitudes. Number two, recreation. The United States, maybe people all around the world, people use our natural environment for enjoyment, for fishing, boating, swimming, hiking, sitting by the water and having a picnic in enormous numbers. 2/3 or more of households, at least once a year, pack up and go do something out in nature. A big chunk of that has to do with visiting places near water bodies. Taking the quantity of those recreation trips, finding a relationship between how many fewer trips people take as a consequence of pollution, and then monetizing that with the value we know people place on those trips is how we proceed to estimate gross external damages. Again, the slide shows you some specifics. I don't want to spend time going through details, and it would mostly be interesting for the economists and not the rest of you. So again, let me jump straight to the number. The gross external damages from reduced enjoyment of recreation from an additional kilogram of nutrients is annually $58 billion. That's our estimate. Recall that the drinking water was 629 million, order of magnitude difference. All right, let's continue. I mentioned that we have not completed the freight and transport part, the downstream part. We have completed it for a couple of the components, and recreation is one of them. This slide depicts the gross external damages associated not only with the damages that occur within the watershed, that Huck 8 at which we're measuring things, but also adds damages downstream. So this includes that freight and transport. The number without the freight and transport, again, that only represents damages within the Huck 8, within the subwatershed where the pollution occurs, was 58 billion. It grows to 67 billion when you consider downstream effects. Of note is the fact that a lot of this pollution occurs and the damages occur in only some locations. That map on the right highlights those subwatersheds that has the most damage. And what jumps out from that map is that the most damaged places are the places that start with a fair amount of pollution, but also have a lot of people. So you will see that you all in the state of Michigan are lighting up very high. Why? Because there's a lot of pollution in and near the watersheds where in Michigan, but there's also a lot of people that are impacted by that. And that's the part that is really important for economics. The addition that we can bring is not only where the pollution is, but where it is most impacting people. And again, if you stare at that map for a while, it's pretty clear that those are very, in general, populated areas. And there are also areas where there's a lot of outdoor recreation and a close enough large populations for people to enjoy visiting. All right, we do the same thing for housing. And again, I'm just going to jump through to show you some numbers. This is where there are housing units, homes that are located within 300 meters of a lake, of at least a small to large lake. Those, the literature has indicated, are the houses for which the value of the house reflects nearby water quality. Again, Michigan, you live in a beautiful area with lots of lakes, and lots of people like to live near those lakes. And so you see that there's a lot of homes in near lakes. When we do the monetization, looking only at local damages, we get an estimate of 45.9 billion. That's very similar, if you remember, from the local damage estimates from the recreation. If we add to that the downstream effects, this time we get a much larger effect. Again, all these numbers are tentative. Please don't take these to the bank, so to speak. I know they will change. I'm guessing that the rough orders of magnitude might not change, but I can't even say that. But in this case, when we consider the downstream effects, we get a much higher estimate. And that just comes from where people live and where houses are located and where those houses are most valuable. Finally, there is a component associated with greenhouse gases. I'm not even going to talk about that. I'm just going to tell you that that is now in the numbers that I'm showing you. What I'm showing you now is a sum of those four sets of damages, which we are confident should be done additively. We've tried to think through very carefully issues of double counting. And so when we add all of the damages, our estimate at the moment is about $20 billion associated with one more unit of nutrient pollution, a kilogram to be specific. This number that I'm showing you right now does not have any of the downstream components. So this number will get bigger and possibly quite a bit bigger when we are able to fully implement the model with all of those downstream damages. Finally, what does all this mean? 117 billion. Let's just take it at a moment that we're somewhere in the ballpark of what we think is ultimately the best estimate. How do you think about that number? Is it big or is it small? Well, let me show you a table to try to give you some context. That gross external damages that our current estimate, which again, it's going to change. That's not the final estimate. But if it were, that would compare to the entire gross domestic product of the US, of which is about $25 trillion. Remember, one of the primary motivations from the very beginning of this talk is to make comparisons between the contribution, the economic contribution of all the goods and services produced that are measured in GDP, 25.461 trillion, but recognize that we really should be subtracting off some numbers from that associated with water pollution and other damages. So another comparison to help provide context of the gross domestic product of the US, that 25 trillion, the amount contributed by agriculture is 289 billion. That's a bit striking to see that our damages, which should be subtracted off, are about a third or almost half that size. Another useful comparator is an estimate of air pollution damages that Nick Muller did. They find that there's about $790 billion damages from agriculture nationwide, and about 220 billion of that is due to agriculture. There are other comparators on here, recreation, home investment, and so on, to give you a sense of again, the magnitude of all of this. This is my last slide. I just want to end by thanking everybody very much for this a great opportunity. I love to get comments and questions, and would welcome any questions now, as well as email comments or anything later on. What we've done here is produce what we think is the first national integrated assessment model. It remains work in progress, but I'm feeling very comfortable that we're really close and have some interesting things. We'll have very interesting things to share soon. And I'll end with this quote from EPA: "Nutrient pollution is one of America's most widespread, costly, and challenging environmental problems." So with that, thank you very much. And I will stop screen sharing and welcome comments and questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for your really fantastic lecture. It's very insightful and stimulating. And I saw several questions already in the Q&A. Maybe the others can continue to welcome to be post the questions in the Q&A box. And please go ahead to address the first question or the question in the Q&A so far. Yeah.
Yes, sure. So the first question, it says, "I'm interested in the social cost issue, particularly whether social cost includes infrastructure costs, such as distribution networks and water treatment and social equity." Fabulous question. The answer is no. What we're doing is much simpler. We are only looking at what economists would call variable cost, which does not include all of those fixed costs, but those fixed costs are important and need to be considered and measured. We also have yet to look at all seriously about equity, but that is very much on our agenda. Because we have this spatial across the landscape range, we know what the income categories, the racial composition of the people that live in the census tracts that are being impacted. And so one of the things we very much want to do is look at where do those costs fall, and what characterizes the populations that are being impacted. Those are great questions. I'll jump to Scott. Hi, nice to see your name anyway, Scott. Scott asked how we measure downstream effects with hedonic property values. I thought those were very location specific. Yep. Absolutely. The location of a house is it's the water body only near it that capitalizes, that impacts the price, exactly, which is what Scott is saying, and he's exactly right. So how does the upstream stuff matter? It matters because pollution moves. And so if pollution is loaded upstream and it moves downstream to that water body, then it has damages. This house is being affected by pollution locally and pollution upstream. And so we want to count all of those impacts um, to get the right marginal damage. Another way to think about it, Scott, and others, is like air pollution. When you have a smokestack, pollution goes up. A little bit of it falls right here. People that live near the factory have to breathe it, but some of it goes all the way to population centers elsewhere. And that's also damages that should be attributed to this smokestack. So that's the way sort of in which it works. Thanks for asking. It's a good chance to explain that. Next question, can the integrated assessment model be helpful in understanding a cholera outbreak? No, I wish it could. The kinds of things we're tracking in this model, we couldn't track something like that. Conceptually, models could be, and probably have been to some extent built where you could do exactly that sort of thing, but that's beyond my expertise. Can the model be downscaled? Yes. It can be downscaled within, in particular, within the Great Lakes watershed, for example. It's already downscaled by Huck 8. So in the Great Lakes watershed, oh, okay. Yeah, in the Great Lakes watershed, we have damages for each Huck 8. If you were interested in downscaling it even more, that could be done, but we're not working at that scale yet. You could move to Huck 12s or elsewhere. Yes. When we compare damages to agriculture GDP, does this really undervalue agriculture? Given the non-market costs of food insecurity, it seems that food agriculture is much more valuable than GDP represents. Great question. There's a whole bunch of stuff wrapped up in there, and the answer to all of it is yes and no and yes. So GDP is a measure of something. There's a lot of things it's not a measure of, which is kind of the point of part of my work. It doesn't measure the damages, but it also doesn't measure things like food security. I'm not quite sure. I've never quite sure how to measure such a thing, but that is definitely not part of GDP, and therefore, yes, there are many things that this is one metric and it doesn't capture everything. So I think that's the best I can do to explain at least my view on that question. Without regulation, seems like our contamination from ag sources will continue. Do you have a comment on the deregulation case brought to the Supreme Court? I am watching it very carefully along with everybody else. I'll be very interested to see. There's been a series of lawsuits on and off over the years, that waters of the U.S. is WOTUS, so to speak, is one issue that is now very much being litigated and through the Supreme Court. So I don't have a comment. I except to say I'm quite interested, and I agree with you that how this stuff works through the courts could have quite an important consequence for how we do these things. I'm sort of just charging through here. Is this a good way? Jack, please let me know if I should be doing something different. I want to be, um, these are great questions.
Yeah, this is great. Continue, please.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
okay, thanks.
yeah.
And again, anybody, please feel free to send me an email or contact me afterwards. Um, do you plan to look at cascading impacts on biodiversity and other ecosystems, such as forests that are also affected? I hope so very much. We can already do a little bit of that by identifying areas, those spatial regions, um, places that are particularly potentially biodiverse, perhaps highly forested areas. We can already would be able to identify the effect, the amount of pollution affecting those areas, and some of the damages we could quantify. But there's so much more that we could, and I hope will do in that area. So main answer is yes. Short answer, not anytime soon, and would welcome ideas about how to do that. Baseline that you're using for calculating these marginal damages. Great question. The baseline we're using is the existing level of nitrogen and phosphorus loading. So conceptually, we've got all this emissions out there. We're taking that level as given, it is what it is. And then we're asking the question, if we were to add 1 kilogram, um, one, what would be the additional damage? What's the marginal damage from that? And what's the marginal, and then we take that and multiply it by that level of emissions. For the economists and students who are economists, this is not a welfare measure, as you've learned in terms of something like compensating or equivalent variation. It's the analog to GDP. GDP takes the price of a good and the existing quantity of the good being produced. We're taking the marginal damage and the existing level of the bad being produced, emissions. We're multiplying them together to get a number that's analogous to GDP. So it's very important to understand what this is and what it's not. As I said, I really think constantly thinking about an GDP as the appropriate comparator of this. Are you familiar with one of the proposed ways to address nutrient loading by using human-derived fertilizers instead of synthetic? As a follow-up, do you know of a way we could model the probability of leaching with different types of fertilizers? So there are I do know there's a lot of different work, a lot of work being done to learn how we can apply fertilizers, all a variety of sources to better have plant uptake of those fertilizers and to prevent loss from the fields. But that's as far as my knowledge goes. There are, of course, terrific agronomists and ag engineers and others who would work much more closely, and you folks at Michigan State could direct you. And I don't know about the probability of leaching with different types of fertilizers. Again, I mean, some of these models have fertilizers that are different, whether it's liquid injection, the timing at which it's applied. So there would be estimates of differences of leaching across those sorts of things. But again, beyond that, you're outside my knowledge base. Barry Commoner raised nitrogen, a nutrient pollution issue 50 years ago, drew a lot of attention. How much improvement was realized, and can we expect better? I can answer the first question. How much improvement was realized is almost none. The best sources of long run data on nitrogen concentrations and pollution comes from a paper appendix from a paper that Dave Kaiser and Joe Shapiro wrote Long-run trends across the U.S., raw averages of many pollutants have dropped substantially since the Clean Water Act and regulations were imposed. Key exceptions include nitrogen and nitrates, where either there's no statistical change over 50 years, or in the case, I think it's nitrates, there's actually a slight upward tick. I hope we, can we expect better? I'll let you answer. What is the path forward to turn these numbers into an ecosystem services market? Path forward is to regulate so that we create markets. We know how markets work very well. There's no surprise that ecosystem service markets are nascent and not really going anywhere in big ways. There's small examples that have worked, but what we know is that there has to be a reason to demand, to be willing to pay to get improvements in ecosystem services. And the way we do that in public policy is we require improvements. We have a standard that is required. We require permits. In some way, we have to have a requirement. That's how we've seen huge improvements in water pollution from industrial sources. It's why our rivers and streams are no longer on fire from industrial pollutants. It's why we have seen huge, incredibly impressive improvements in water quality across many, many pollutants. But it's also why we haven't seen them in nutrient pollution, because the vast majority is coming from a sector that it has no such requirements. And let me be really clear, agriculture is very valuable. This isn't like an anti-ag thing. It's just a very simple economic externality thing. Energy is incredibly important. We produce energy, but we also recognize that there's an externality associated, and we do things to simultaneously control the externality, to keep the pollutant levels down, and to enjoy the many wonderful benefits of energy. We have not taken that stance as a society with water pollution coming from agriculture. And it's a decision that society seems to have made. We could change our mind and do things differently, but anyway, one more question I see. Are you estimating downstream effects of nutrient pollution traveling through humans, wildlife, or other modes? No, that's super interesting. Right now, all we're trying to get a handle on is surface water movement. We don't even have groundwater in here yet. So I want to be very clear about all of the pieces that are still missing. And that's one of them. That's a super interesting idea. Thank you. And I know I've used up our time. Apologies.
Yeah, thank you so much. We run out the time, but I really appreciate all the excellent answers and also the wonderful questions. And thank you so much for your really fantastic lecture again. And also, I'd like to thank the audience for participating in this lecture so actively. And so everybody's time is really appreciated. And so goodbye, and everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day or evening, or depending on where you are. So thank you so much again. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. It's been great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah. Thank you so much.